if you may allow us, we would like to begin our session with Maaz Bin Bilal on a wonderful translation of a book called Chatta Darya, which he translates as the Sixth River. And that is the book that we are going to be talking about. Now, what I don't know is how many of you in the audience, for those of us who have been working with the partition of the Indian subcontinent, or who have either come from families with partition survivors from 1947, or who have been living in parts of northern India where it's impossible not to be encountering some memory of partition in almost every third or fourth person that you meet. And there are cities in India which reconfigured in the wake of partition. So the ramifications of Indian partition which are to be felt in many parts of India, but I think particularly in certain northern and western parts of India, they become sort of more tangible. And it is in that zone, it is in that experience, that history, that event and metaphor where Maaz's translation figures, where Maaz brings a very, very new unknown voice. And it's a voice that is perhaps known to Urdu reading publics, but it is clearly not known to people who don't read in Urdu. And what I find it quite remarkable is that Maaz is not talking about a Manto or Faiz, but he picks a relatively unknown person and a very interesting person called Fikr. And it is Fikr's prose, his everyday journal during the ravaging, destroying, decaying sort of humanity of partition that this particular journal has been written. And Fikr himself has a kind of a nature where he manages to write with great honesty, with poignancy, but he's also a satirist. So he also manages to have this satirical sort of a tone to it. And Fikr himself was a columnist who had a very successful column, which a lot of Urdu reading public talk about, which was called Pyaj ke Chilke, right? Pyaj ke Chilke, which is the onion peel. I find it quite appropriate because considering how onions as of yesterday were 120 rupees a kilo, that all you can afford is really the peel of the onion rather than the onion itself. So this is the journal that Maaz has chosen to translate. And I will sort of hand over to him now to tell us what inspired him to undertake this translation, and also what relationship do you perceive between yourself and this text, and also with the act of translation. What does the act of translation mean to you beyond its linguistic transfer from Urdu to English? How do you see yourself in that act yourself? Yeah.
Right. Okay. Thank you, Rita, for a wonderful introduction. I see three questions there. One is about my motivations for translating this, my own connections to partition, and finally how I approach translation itself. The first two are quite definitively related for this translation in particular. Like Rita said, many families in the north have a history in partition, as does mine. What is slightly different about mine is what often does not get acknowledged is that partition also forced a lot of internal migration and internal violence sometimes that is not recognized. So I come from a Muslim background, but my family was, on my father's side, they were in Ludhiana, and but they were staunch nationalists and of the Congress, in the INC kind, and they had their own political party which was affiliated with them. So they chose not to go to Pakistan, but in fact, for simply the sake of security, chose to migrate even more inward to the capital, Delhi. That's where later I was born and I've grown up. My mother's side of the family, again, was in Delhi, but in Paharganj. And then Paharganj was almost forcibly evacuated by people here. So they tried to migrate to Pakistan on the train. There were some tragedies there, and then they ended up back in. My nani, my grandmother's, my maternal grandmother's parents and all, they died, and then they came back again to Delhi because there were some relatives who were here. So there are, partition involves tragedies that haven't been talked about enough, and they haven't been understood fully. There are ways that they haven't been talked about or written about. And Fikr then is one such character, one such author. He's a poet at the time of partition. And then when partition happens, he shifts to satire. And this journal that we have here with us now, in my translation as the sixth river, but called Chhata Darya originally, talks about this sixth river of violence that flowed across the Punjab, the land of the 5 rivers, Panj meaning 5 and Ab being waters. So I gravitated towards this text the moment I came across it. I was pointed to Fikr Tonswi in general by the prolific Urdu translator Rakhshanda Jalil, who's also here. But then I discovered this text, this Chhata Darya, and it immediately drew me to it. As you've also pointed out, but I came across a review of this book that came out last week actually, and I happened to miss it, and I saw it today for the first time, written by a partition scholar again, Debjani Sengupta. And some things, the way she put it, I thought was good to illustrate for myself even what drew me to the text. She sees this text in surrealistic terms. And it's a badly abused word, surrealism often. It's an easy term. But Fikr is actually, while describing his own psyche, the mood of the moment, the environment of Lahore, where he's based at the time, is interrogating it in terms of layers, really. He's talking about his own mental layers. He's describing sometimes a Plato inside him, something that clings to his cerebrum like a lizard. He's describing different layers of violence in the air, the fear that anyone may stab anyone, friends have become foes. And while doing all of this, he's never self-pitying. I think that was what was most attractive for me in the text. And he is also, his given name is Ramlal Bhatia. So he's from a Hindu background. And the violence that he's experiencing, and the immediate violence that he experiences, his daughter is killed by his close friend, who is a Muslim. And it's a strange predicament that he produces there for us. And it's dealt with in very precise few paragraphs. And, but it is all the more powerful for it. And there, the perpetrator is a Muslim, and he's a Hindu, but he still manages to transcend this communal divide between the two and sees it as a moment of madness that the friend has committed the act in. And you see it from the friend also. Once having killed the daughter of his own close friend, he's brought his own son to Fikr, telling him that you please now kill my son, because I have killed your daughter. It's almost Abrahamic, this act. This is where Abraham is ready to sacrifice for God his child. But this is almost another father ready to sacrifice his child as an act of atonement to friendship. And friendship, again, is my interest area. My research work, my PhD work is on friendship. And this text is acutely about friendships too. The reason Fikr finally decides to leave Lahore and Pakistan and come to India is because he is betrayed by a friend. He feels betrayed by a close friend who has been suggesting to him with increasing almost coercion at times that he should convert, he should think about converting, or leave perhaps. And in that kind of an environment, Fikr finally feels compelled to leave. And so much of life is about friendships and affected the politics and the personal lives of people at the time of partition. And again, to quote from autobiography, in that sense, my family, like I said, was close to INC, some of the prominent leaders at that time. It was their friendship, their close affiliation with them that prompted them to stay on. They were invited to come to Delhi and live in Delhi and help, they were helped and set up in that. So I think that answers the first two questions of yours. About translation, then I approached it as an act of commitment. I approached it humbly. I wanted to be as faithful to the tone, particularly, and to the undercurrents of Fikr's satire, his dark humor at times, or the dryness of his prose, things like that. And in a general sense, something else that I would like to add about translation and how I approach it is, I also try to always seek out texts that definitely speak to me, but I also think speak to the times.
Yeah.
And the Sixth River speaks strongly to our times. There have been almost two opposing theories about partition, that one says partition was final and now both nations or three nations of India, Pakistan and Bangladesh, think of themselves as entities, but there is another theory which looks at it as the long partition. And even though the South, for example, wasn't affected much by partition in 1947, but I think there are increasing instances where that long partition is in fact now coming to the south of India too.
Thank you. In fact, I'm so glad you mentioned friendship, because that's exactly what sort of stood out for me. And I think I want for us to spend for a moment to think about partition, border making, dividing territories, making borders, maintaining boundaries, as also a kind of a persistent practice of things that we do in everyday life, right? We make borders around ourselves of those we don't want to cohabit with, those we don't want to co-dine with, those we don't want to be with. And there is, in this history of border making, if there is one thing which is very often critiquing both nationalism and border making practices, it is actually friendship, right? And I'm also thinking of friendship here in more expansive ways, not only Fikr's own friendships, and clearly there is something similar happening even to Manto, when he realizes that some rupture has happened in friendship, and then what's the point of living here, right? It's a different matter that even after moving to Pakistan, he feels more alienation and he doesn't find what. So this idea of jo rishte hote hain, this idea of friendship which is constantly put to pressure by imperatives of the nation. And you see that even in, for instance, in that sense, all kinds of stories of love also already have a story of partition in them. So the book talks about Heer Ranja and Soni Maiwal and so on. So I think it's kind of very productive for us to think about ancestries of love and border making practices as things that always go together. That whenever love threatens to cross too many boundaries, there are ways by which those boundaries are formed, and there's a certain way by which love and friendship manage to critique it somewhat, even if they don't transcend it, and it's not always possible to transcend, and it may also be unfair to expect to transcend all the time, but they still manage to sort of critique it. So I think it's a very, very valuable book, even from that point of view. Actually, the second question I also had was this, that you find in this book, for instance, I've translated some literature around the communal riots in Gujarat, right? And this idea that when there is inexorable hatred, and when you find violent forces of humanity unleash upon you, and you are looking at your library and you're looking at a Buddha or a Confucius or Gandhi or Gita or Mahabharata or even Marquez or whatever, And this question that you ask yourself, that all that was supposed to have made us humans or human civilization into this sort of pinnacle of fine thought and of fine behavior, was it so fragile that it doesn't mean anything today? And it happens to Fikr as well, right? He's looking at all those books, and I have found so many instances of this, of suddenly people looking at the libraries around them and thinking of all those slogans that are playing outside, and people are killing each other, and then you say, what price is this book? Why are we even bothering to read or to teach or anything for that matter? So I also want to ask you whether in your work around this book and also the family you come from, whether you find there is something typical about an educated Muslim's response but not that Fikra himself is, but I think to say Fikra is Hindu or Muslim is a very stupid question, I feel. It's not, I think it sort of goes against the grain of the kind of book that it is. So I don't want to be saying he's of Hindu origins, but he's very much this or that. Right. But do you find that an educated person's anguish being sort of played out in this manner in many instances where you begin to think like there is a vast chasm that lies between all those finer things that we do and the beastly reality that that partition actually throws up?
Quite definitely. So what particularly in the north of India is happening, and a certain kind of literati, intelligentsia keeps doing, is trying to prop up what is called in Hindi Urdu Ganga Jamni Tehzeeb, which is this syncretic kind of civilization of North India, so-called syncretic civilization of North India, where people have problematically also, but in agreement sometimes, called the language to be Hindustani, although other scholars have argued that really the term itself is of British origin. But there are often attempts to prop this up in almost petty ways, that yes, there has always been friendship between different peoples of North India and it's all hunky-dory. And in contrast to this are stark realities of division. But there is also a philosophical argument to be made, as you were saying, whenever there is a Heer Ranja, that so that wherever the deepest of bonds, personal bonds do come up, that is when they threaten the formation of a homogeneous political. I'm afraid I might be getting too theoretic from here, but I've actually done, my PhD work was on the politics of friendship in E.M. Foster's work particularly. But this is, it was a Nazi jurist, Carl Schmitt, who's talked about the formation of the political in this fashion. And you see it happening around you, around us, in different ways, across the world, that there are almost monolithic entities that are being created, which in fact preclude conversations across any divide. And these divides are also being artificially created to a large extent. You see this in religion, you see this in diet, what people may or may not eat, and how people who eat one thing may not interact with people who eat another. You see this in regionalism in other places. In Europe, for example, empire is undergoing its own final partition in a way. In England, in Britain, Brexit is being heavily debated, and Brexit is also passing off this burden of other insecurities to the outsider, really. So it's either how there are solidarities that may emerge and may threaten power, that then lead to these cleavages and to these making of borders, or the fact that other problems are being covered up by creating these divisions. So at one level, when there is very little to do, perhaps, at the level of the overtly political or electoral politics, uh, it is perhaps then tirelessly working to emphasize that personal relations are possible with the other, and to show their potential to people as well.
Yeah.
So one doesn't do this in a superficial manner, to just say yes, everyone can be friends and everything will be hunky-dory, but to realize the true political potential also of personal friendships. I'll take one more moment. Nandita Haksar, I've been wanting to meet her. I don't know if she's here yet. She, for example, has this one essay in one of her books about the friendship that emerged between her, a Kashmiri Pandit, and the Kashmiri Muslim and his brother, S.A.R. Jilani, who passed away recently, and his brother, Sayyid Bismillah Jilani, that emerged as she was trying to defend him, and the various dimensions that it had over time. Whereas in popular discourse, Pandits are, of course, who are pitted against Kashmiri Muslims. And during the court case, their relationship is what emerges and also consolidates the final acquittal of S.A.R. Jilani. So there is political potential from friendship that can be very real at times also.
No, that's a great example. I think what we might want to do now is that, because there are also young students who may not know enough about the partition history and so forth. So we will open this up for Q&A, and I would encourage actually even young students here, if there are questions about partition, if this is something you've thought about or you want to talk more about, then I think this is a good time to do it, because this is not a past that is over and done with. There is partition with a capital P, but there are also, as the writer Kamleshwar says, kitne Pakistan. So there are also partitions with the small p that happen all the time, and every time we say, oh, this is a ghetto, this is a mini Pakistan, or these people do that, all forms of othering in some sense rehearse partition all the time. And I think Maaz said something really pertinent at the beginning of this session, and he said we are in some sense living today in the times of partition. You know, people talk about this being a moment of cultural emergency, but really speaking, it is also a moment of partition. I think the language of the non-inclusive and the language of a certain kind of duality, which is mutually exclusive, is very, very, it's very alive in our times. In a way that I don't remember it being like this before. So we are very much in the time of partition. I think we might want to understand this not only in its past forms, but also in its present avatars. So with that, I would like to open this house to Q&A for Maaz, for the book, or even generally. This is a classic question.
Shall we take one? If there are any other questions, we can take more questions and I can answer them together. Okay, I'll start with this. Gandhi played, of course, a hugely important role, but it's also a heavily contested role. And I am not really an expert on...
He was not in favor of partition, if that is what your question is.
Yes, he was not in favor
Gandhi
of it,
was not in favor of partition.
But whether
he was criticized a lot, actually.
Yes. But whether he could have prevented it...
Sorry?
Yes.
So to answer really briefly, quickly, so that he can have other questions. First of all, Gandhi's own significance around that time had reduced considerably. Gandhi's peak period was almost over. There were other forces who were far more influential and far more powerful at that time. And I think the tendency to put all the blame and burden on Gandhi is historically wrong. I mean, it is wrong in many ways, but historically also it's wrong.
And also, if I may add, even post-event, he was trying to remedy some of it. Yeah. And in fact, that is what led to his death by Hindutva forces.
Yeah. Any other question? Yeah? So I'm going to ask Maaz to show the book.
Oh.
This is supposed to be a book launch, and I would like us to join in congratulating him on this really lovely book. I mean, I teach many courses on partition and I write on partition. I think this is a very, very valuable book that needs to be. Why don't you open it, and maybe we need to.
Excuse me?
Yes.
Could he read a passage from the book?
Yeah, most certainly. You have a question? Okay, we'll just listen to her. Tell us.
I'm just wondering, can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. I'm just wondering if you could speak a little bit to the idea of border crossings and putting up borders and the role of translation in this. Why is this such an important, I'm an outsider, of course. I'm coming at it. I'm very happy that this is available in English. What is the importance of translating this into English?
So I hinted at it, but of course these kinds of subtleties are not as visible to people who are not from the subcontinent. But there are various things to this. One that I hinted at, for example, is the fact that fikr comes from a Hindu background. How that becomes important, particularly with regard to translation, I'm going to explain, is that he writes the text in Urdu. And Urdu is the national language now of Pakistan, which is considered the enemy state post-partition. It's also an official language in India. But despite that, often it becomes, for a certain section, almost an enemy language. So to translate an Urdu text and to prop up a writer who's not Muslim, who most inhabitants of the enemy state Pakistan are, and therefore, but still writing in Urdu, that was also a conscious act. And there has been a partial sort of elision almost of non-Muslim writers in the Urdu canon also, for which even the Muslim canon makers are responsible. So Hindi, Urdu are also have been originally due to British intervention, but the languages have been communalized, and which they aren't. A language is not of necessarily only a religious community, and Urdu wasn't that to begin with. And now in India, most people cannot read the script. Many Indian languages were originally written in this script. Sindhi, on which Rita works, is originally in the script, and many other languages. So I'll just finish with a quick reading. Perhaps I'll read the passage which describes the death of the daughter. It's a very powerful one, as I find it. Yeah, okay. All of Punjab is burning. The flame has reached Acha's brow and Batala. In Tausa, my wife's sari is catching fire from the crackling blaze. I've reached my village. My daughter reaches the house of Ali Muhammad Butt as she plays. And Ali Muhammad Butt has picked her up and dashed her on the ground with real force. Her soft, delicate bones are broken into bits. Ali Muhammad is my childhood friend and companion. We used to play gilli danda together in the colony. He's a big landlord in the settlement now and writes letters full of affection to me. He has brought the body of my dead daughter to my house. Forgive me, my friend. I did not break this branch. A harsh and rapid gust of wind came, and she broke with a snap to fall into my yard. His eyes are wet with tears. There is uproar in the village. Clack, clack, clack. Possibly the Masoodi clan had attacked the village once again, and Hindus and Muslims are combating them together. Maybe the Hindu-Sikh military has started gunning down the Muslims, and the Muslims have started firing at the Hindus. My daughter lies dead on the ground, and Ali Muhammad is handing his 6-year-old son to me. Fling him, Fikr Bhai. Dash him hard on the ground, such that my sins may be forgiven. My heart may come to rest, and I stand punished. Dash him, my friend. I hug the little rose-like Rashid to my heart. Go away, Ali Muhammad. You have gone mad. Why don't you get yourself treated? Go. I will not give Rashid to you. Rashid, my son.